Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining Tip the Mitt Watershed Council's Icebreaker Winter Speaker Series on the Little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa Indians' Lake Sturgeon restoration efforts. We are all so excited to hear more about these iconic fish. I'm Jen DeMoss, the Watershed Council's Communications Director, and I'm here to introduce our speaker. This is the fourth webinar in our series. Excuse me, I have actually gotten my slides a little bit mixed up here. This is the fourth webinar in our series, and we have 2 more talks in March, so stay tuned for more information about them. I am really excited to turn it over to our guest speaker, but first a few words. First, all lines will be muted during the presentation. There will be time for questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. If you have a question, you can go ahead and type it into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen there. We most likely won't be monitoring the chat, so try to keep it to the Q&A box. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and I'll post it on our YouTube channel within a week of this event. And you should get an email within about a week with a link to that recording. If you're one of those people who doesn't like to have that strip of presenters' faces on the side of the PowerPoint, this is help for you. All you need to do to minimize that is to click that little gray bar. You can see this giant red arrow pointing to that little gray bar on that kind of little space of talking heads, and that will minimize the faces. If you want to expand it back out again, you can click on one of the rectangles to the right of that. For those of you who might not be familiar with us, we're a nonprofit membership-based organization with over 40 years of history protecting and improving water resources in northern Michigan. We are dedicated to protecting our lakes, streams, wetlands, and groundwater through advocacy, education, water quality, research, and restoration activities. And we've been operating in northern Michigan for over 40 years. Our service area includes Emmett, Antrim, Charlevoix, and Sheboygan counties, and we are thrilled to be part of caretaking our region's precious water resources. We would also like to recognize that our service area lies within the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe. We will continue to work alongside them to honor and protect this area for the next 7 generations. I wanted to give you a heads up. We have 2 more icebreakers after this one. A rescheduled presentation on loons and avian botulism with Damon McCormick, and rolling on the rivers with Brian Kosminski, who will share stories about his explorations of northern Michigan rivers. So you can watch recordings of our previous icebreakers on our YouTube channel, which is down there below on the screen. And if you want to register for these events, go ahead and go to watershedcouncil.org/attend-an-event, or just go to our website, search for icebreakers, and you can register there exactly where you registered for this one. Now, I am pleased to introduce our speaker. Kris has been managing the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians fish hatchery and research facility for 7 years. He's worked on many research projects with LTBB, including hatchery-based restoration options for lake whitefish and cisco in Lake Michigan, investigating kayak culture methods, and investigating the possibility of restoring river-run lake whitefish. Along with these research projects, Kris has worked on restoring the Burt Lake Watershed's lake sturgeon population since 2013. Kris's presentation will provide a quick introduction of LTBB and treaty rights and historic perspective to the status of lake sturgeon in Michigan, with examples of LTBB's current work in northern Michigan. So Kris, I am going to stop sharing my PowerPoint and let you take it away. And thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
See if I can do this. Can you guys see a river?
Yep, looks nice.
Oh, good. That's the first step. And then we'll try to throw this up here. All right, so I'm Kris. I'm the hatchery manager for Little Traverse Bay Bands. I work at the Fisheries Enhancement Facility. We often just call it the hatchery. Now, we primarily do a lot of research, but we also do restoration and education. And really, the 2 biggest restoration and education projects we have involves sturgeon. So it's fitting that we have a presentation for that. I'm going to try to talk about a little bit about, maybe if you don't know the tribe in general, maybe treaty rights. I'm going to hopefully get into a little bit of that, a little bit of sturgeon biology, what we're doing with sturgeon, and maybe, how we're going to ensure that we have sturgeon for the next 7 generations. And to really quickly, super quick, very vague, we're going to go over prior to European settlement. There were a lot of people who lived here, many nations, whether it was the Potawatomi, the Odawa, the Chippewa, a lot of nations here. They had treaties. There were these treaties like identified fishing, hunting, all that stuff. And worked really, really well for a really long time. I mean, there's evidence people lived here at least 7,000 years ago. Now, the Great Lakes in general, prior to European settlement, were probably teeming with fish to a level that we don't fully understand today. And you'll see it later on. I have some charts of just the general trend of all the fishery stocks. And so you'll kind of get a picture of that. But when European settlement first started coming in and they came into this area, you'll see the yellow part of this map is the 1836 treaty area. I'll turn on my laser pointer, see if you guys can see. But anyways, so 1836 Treaty of Washington, I believe, at least in Harbor Springs, I think they left in a G-Mon or canoe in like November. Somebody probably knows that better than I do. But anyways, they went off to Washington, D.C. They signed this treaty, and that included Little River, Grand Traverse bands, Little Traverse, Sioux Tribe, and Bay Mills. So those five are actually all within the same treaty. That treaty then, there were 13 different stipulations within that. One of them was that the federal government would support the tribes in perpetuity. Another one was that, the tribes would join the U.S. But the most important one is Article 13 of the treaty. Now, this article retained, and that's a very important word, retained the rights for fishing and hunting. Now, this is also kind of the origin of where our management authority comes from, because we need to be able to have the management authority as partners in managing the resource so that we can still have hunting and fishing. If the resource is gone, you can't really do much. And as you might imagine, this actually got ignored for about 185 years. So it wasn't until 1994 did Bill Clinton sign a bill that basically reaffirmed everything, said, hey, this thing actually happened. You guys need to be paying attention. So shortly thereafter, they probably formed what maybe would be the official on paper, the LTBB government, Natural Resource Department. They hired a biologist, a conservation officer, and they started issuing commercial fishing permits. And if you work with the tribe, you may have heard of Sovereignty Day. It is September 21st. And when they formed the government, they kind of had to build it in increments. So to give some history of our natural resource and our tribe in general, in 2000, I think it was, or 2002, early 2000s, they built the main government complex, which is where on the right of this picture is the executive branch and on the left is the legislative branch. The judicial branch is actually in the 9/11 building across from Dunham's and Bed Bath & Beyond. But anyways, once they got everything kind of organized, I think what's really cool is that the shift, at least for natural resources, was to do more. So then they moved on and they started talking about maybe building a hatchery. The earliest documentation I can find is like 2002 or 2008, but they got really serious in 2008 about it. And as fast as things go, they were actually able to start construction on a new hatchery in 2012, and they finished up in 2013. And so this was the chance for our tribe to start doing something beyond letting the state or the feds stock for us or pick the priorities for us. We are now in the driver's seat. And this is really interesting too. This is in our Natural Resource Department. Everything is funded through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which manages those treaties, right? The 1836 treaty. When it said they would support us in perpetuity, a lot of that funding is routed through the BIA. The only part of the Natural Resources Department that is not funded that way is the hatchery. That is a general fund straight from the, whatever casino or whatever avenue. So I'd like to start kind of from this point, because the really interesting thing is that we started with sturgeon in 2013 as the first fish in the building. And I'm going to kind of get into why, and I'm going to jump quick into their life cycle and their biology and stuff like that, just so we're all on the same page. Now, I took pictures. I believe the only picture I did not take is the top left, but everybody else, we took all these pictures ourselves, and these are all from the Black River and Burt Lake system. So the fish will spawn in April, late April, mostly in May and June, but sometimes they catch that last few days of April. They'll spawn in like a deeper bend on a river and they'll spawn in the back of it. They want the eggs to wash up into the riffle behind the hole. Those eggs will incubate for maybe 14 days. They'll hatch. Now, when they hatch, they don't just go about their day. They actually burrow into the sediment, and they'll stay there for maybe 10 days. All this depends on water temperature too, but they're absorbing their yolk sac, and they're growing. Now, at night, they'll drift up into the water column and float. We call that larval drift. Now, this is when we collect them. Now, there's a couple advantages that we can read, like how good the year class may be, depending on how many we find, but it's also a great time to collect these larvae for stocking purposes. So we can go and try to raise these fish for a certain period of time and then stock them back out. The fish on the top right is a size that we typically stock out. And I'll get into why that is or why that size was chosen. But for the most part, we don't really see any survival between that second and third picture. But I put in here a couple pictures of smaller fish. I wrote juvenile and subadult. Those probably could be interchangeable, but for the most part, I think when the fish are still spiky, we call those juveniles. And when we get up to subadult, they've grayed out and they've rounded off. They're no longer really sharp. But again, it's going to take them between 15 and 25 years to mature, and that's based on sex. And the fish Mike here, our senior tech, is holding on the far left, that fish may be 60, 70 years old. A lot of these fish can live over 100 years old. I want to say in Lake Erie, they found a couple a long time ago that were well over 150 years old. So they have a really long life cycle, and I think it's going to come into play later. So I would like to keep that in mind when you move forward. In talking about the Black River, it's really important to note too that the Black River system we do a lot of work on and work with. We work with Michigan State University and the MDNR. They have that facility on the Black River, and they've been working there since like 2000, I think. And they've been doing a great job. And this is the most studied population probably in North America, or maybe the world, I don't know. But certainly they're diving the river during the spawning run and capturing every fish they can, marking, tagging, doing biodata. We used to spawn those fish, but now larval drift has actually come to a point that we can rely on that with some stability, so we don't have to artificially insert ourselves during the spawning process. But these guys, we send somebody Monday through Friday out to do this, whether it's the diving or the larval drift. We kind of like to make certain that we're offering our help to keep this going. Okay, so that's my bit on Black River, and you're going to hear Black River a lot, and I just want you guys to know, this is like an epicenter of sturgeon right now. And now I'm going to get on to like the decline of sturgeon, and I think this part is, it seems obvious in some ways, but I think I should probably restate it that prior to European settlement, things were more in a subsistence style fishery. Few fish were harvested. They're directly consumed or, distributed through the community. Once Europeans kind of entered the scene, we changed the way fishing worked. We became a market style fishing. And with markets, you're not aiming for food, you're aiming for money. And so that's when you get that disconnect. If there weren't enough fish for you to, eat or eat easily, you would just move on to something else. But with market style fishing, you'll keep fishing even though you're not catching a lot. And you may be making less and less money with the more and more fish you make, supply and demand. And so things can kind of get out of hand. But this change is kind of what you'll see in the next few graphs. And I like to show this slide. It's really not important to like what the numbers really are. I think the scale bars are the most important part of this graph. It's got a goofy, they wrote it down really goofy, and I for whatever reason kept it, but it was the top of the bar graph there is 10 million pounds of fish. Okay, so at one point we were harvesting over 8.5 million pounds of sturgeon annually. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in real quick because you can't really see the bottom at all after 1920 or something like that. So we'll zoom in. You'll notice that there's a lot of colors missing because the lakes are in individual colors. A lot of colors are missing early on, and a lot of data is missing. That's indicative of that era. We just don't have good information. It wasn't until like 1860 where people really concerned about the Great Lakes fishery to the point that they were like, we should start recording this stuff. And it took them 20 years just to get somebody to start recording. And it took them like 60 years to get some kind of continuity with recording this kind of data. So we know that likely the harvest was much higher early on than what we have record for. 1885 is the only year that we had all the lakes report in on the same year prior to 1890. But it's a precipitous, exponential decay. So we went from 10 million pounds. Now I'm going to jump 1920 to current day. Scale bar changes. And that's really the important part here. We're at 140,000 pounds. When we had 8.5 million pounds in one year in like 1885, that's like 189 semi trucks loaded to the brim. Just as like some perspective, but this decay just kept happening. In 1970, the reason you see a shift here is the laws changed. They changed the fishing regulations, so that's why everything drops below 20,000 pounds at that point. And really, that law change is probably a big reason we have fish today. Now I'm going to quick go over. This is a publication I found, article. They kind of took the same data. Now their graphs are separated by lake, and it's in metric, but it's the same data set. But they did some cool stuff with this where they dove in and they looked at, what would be a theoretical sustainable harvest that we could do on this annually. They also looked at, well, if we stopped harvesting and we just let them go, how long would it take for a restoration to happen on its own? And so there were those two things kind of, I think, are paired. And it's important to know this moving forward because it's going to give you a lot of perspective on how long a restoration may take or to like what degree restoration might look like. Of these six, the best case scenario on exploitation was like 3.1% was the highest and 2.0% was the lowest. Okay, so as managers, we don't want to be too risky, right? So, I mean, you're talking about a 1.5% safe level of harvest on any of these systems is probably where you would try to manage. So that 1.5% is important, and we'll probably talk about it here in a minute. Now, when we think about the restoration, how long it may take if we just let them go, when they looked at that, the shortest time period was Lake Huron, and it took 60 years, or would take. And then the longest was Lake Michigan, and it may take 100 years. Now, there's a really, really important caveat to that, is that that's with all impediments removed. So there's no fishing pressure, there's no contaminants in any of the rivers, and there's no dams. Dams do not exist under this scenario. So that's not going to happen, right? There's no way that I think we'll have all the dams instantly removed so that we can have restoration happen and for it to happen for 100 years. And just to drive home the point of how many fish are left, as some of the early graphs were showing, this is a slide from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, we include it in our Sturgeon Classroom program, but I just thought this drove home the point even farther, and I thought it was really, really good. They go through and they do a summary of some of the published data on how many fish are left in Lake Michigan. Now, if you look at it, you're going to realize most of the fish are in the lower Green Bay in the Wisconsin waters, and that's because they're coming from Lake Winnebago. And at the time they had 20,000, I think they're over 40,000 now. But that's where a lot of the restoration happened. Lake Winnebago is like their Black Lake, except it's enormous. But really, in all of Lake Michigan, there's less than 3,000 fish left, adult fish left. And to think about that, at one point we had between 1 and 2.4 million sturgeon in Lake Michigan. So you're talking less than 0.01%. And I like to compare that. If you had $1,000, we spent all but 10 cents. We're at 10 cents out of 1,000. That's where we're at. Okay. And to really point that out even farther, if you take all the rivers in Michigan, so Manistee, Muskegon, Grand, Kalamazoo, all the way around through Indiana, Illinois, and southern Wisconsin, there are only 300 sturgeon remaining. Okay, so that's kind of shocking. There's only 300 fish in Lake Michigan, in Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and southern Wisconsin. In some comparison, for us on having Black Lake as a close by example, there are, in 2011, we're over 900 adults in Black Lake. So there's 3 times as many fish in Black Lake than there is in all of Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and southern Wisconsin. So it kind of becomes apparent why most of our restoration started with Black Lake. I mean, there was really nowhere else to turn. You know, some of the Lake Michigan tributaries don't really have an option. There's really nowhere they can go. So they're kind of working through that. But on the bright side, I would say that it isn't all bad. We didn't lose all of our fish. So Gary, our new inland biologist on the top left here, is holding a fish from last year, I believe. And that was the biggest fish they had caught that last year, I believe. But the fact is that we still have some fish left that we can base the restoration on, where we have a situation where we can collect larval drift and we can stock them, which is the top right picture. We know that the stocking can be successful. The fish on the bottom left was stocked in about 20 or 30 years ago. So that fish is semi young. And then I think these bottom 2 fish, I believe, were the only 2 fish in our surveys on Burt Lake that were naturally reproduced. But that's a fantastic finding. You know, we've netted how many fish out of that lake? We found a couple that were naturally reproduced. And so the fantastic part about that is that maybe if we get the levels up to a point, maybe they can do this on their own. And then we come into like hurdles that, you know, why may they not be recovering as fast as we had hoped, or why may it take 100 years? So looking forward, we're going to have to deal with genetic diversity, and it's not a problem everywhere. It's just a problem in certain places. Like if you remember the Lake Michigan map, some of those maps or some of those rivers only had 25 fish left, you know, maybe a couple dozen, maybe 3 dozen fish left. So in those situations, they're typically below what we believe to be viable. And so they'll need genetic rescue via stocking. I put on here adult survival. And I think that really we need to pay attention to that, because as we get more fish, people are going to want to harvest more and more. And we need to keep in mind that we already know what, you know, theoretically is probably a safe level at 1.5%. And we know that if we screw up, that same paper told us that it may take 100 years to fix. So there's kind of that fine line. And then I have age listed here. Most of the fish that are remaining from this original over harvest, they're pretty old. So we have a foundation, but that foundation won't last forever. And now the number one problem for sturgeon at this point is recruitment. And so I broke it down into 2 sections. I'm sure you could probably leave them all as one, but spawning success, so the fish's ability to put those eggs down and have them hatch. I put contaminants on there. I don't think there's been a ton of work done on that, but certainly I probably foresee within the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be quite a bit. As you probably know, dams are a big problem. And it's not necessarily that the dams are preventing the fish from going upstream, like too far. That is a problem. But the dams normally are put on the point where the grade is the steepest, so they can get that lake behind there and get that head pressure. Well, those areas are also where the rapids used to be. So the dam is sitting on their historical spawning habitat. So when they lose that access to that, that's partly why they're having problems. There's not anywhere else to go in many cases. And I put on here habitat. That's not necessarily a problem we have in this area. A good example would be like the shipping channels going through the Detroit, the St. Clair, the St. Mary's, places like that where they're dredging. Often they'll either have to dig through the spawning grounds, or they'll cover it up with sediment. I put on here offspring survival, and I put on there spawning run size. Now this comes back to like Black Lake, and we know that they have quite a few fish running the river, but they're still not really recruiting much of anything. You know, they may have 200 or 300 fish running, but it may only equate to one, if any, offspring. So we know that there's like a tipping point. Once that tipping point gets reached, then they start recruiting pretty well. So it's a shotgun approach, and that deals a lot with predation. You need to be able to overwhelm the predators, and if you don't have enough, they tend to eat everything. And again, habitat and river miles, this is a problem of dams. So the dams, yes, they obviously block all the spawning habitat, but if the dam is like the Manistee, it's within the first mile of the river, and that's a pretty long river. because they can't spawn farther upstream, typically if and when the fish do hatch there, they drift right out into the lake, and they're not really meant to do that. Like, they have way better survival. And the reason that the fish were spawning in the river to begin with is that they were going up and they were getting caught on each bend of the river. And so that gave them all these opportunities and all these different habitats. So those are like the major hurdles. And I'm kind of just going to point out that I'm very, optimistic when I do see different dam removal projects, because I think you guys should see this. If you do see dam removal, you should see it as like a restoration for the sturgeon kind of thing. Like, this is really, really going to help any sturgeon restoration. A lot of these rivers we can't even consider because there's a dam at the mouth. And this isn't just for sturgeon. I would say like burbot, round whitefish, lake whitefish, cisco, a lot of the shiners and fish like that, like the run up rivers or up creeks to spawn. We've put a dam on almost every single one of them. Try to think of a major river that doesn't have a dam on it. I mean, it's really hard to find. A good example would be like the Bear River in Petoskey. We don't see burbot much or round whitefish anymore in the bay. Well, they can't really run the river anyway. So if they're going to be here, they have to come from the next river that doesn't have a dam. And you can try to think of where that might be. It's quite a ways. So just think about dams and their connectivity. It affects more than just sturgeon. And I'm going to touch a little bit, kind of throw out some examples of what Little Travers is doing with sturgeon management and our restoration efforts. Now, we chose to kind of single out one water body and kind of work at that, go towards that. Let's see if we can restore that one. And then maybe after that, we'll move on to another one and we'll just keep going. So we picked Burt Lake out of the Sheboygan River watershed. And we made a management plan that kind of outlines all of our steps. What do we do next? What should we be doing? When to expect certain things? How we calculate certain things. So you guys should all know the Burt Lake watershed. It's super big as far as the lake is concerned at 17,000 acres. And I'm sure that changes as if the water level is high or low. But really, it's a big lake. And we believe all of the lake is excellent habitat for sturgeon. Mullet Lake actually has quite a bit of water that's too deep that sturgeon may try to avoid. So Burt Lake seemed like a great option. The fact that the Sturgeon River on the south side doesn't have any barriers, there's no dams, and it just fully connected the whole way, that really lit us up to be like, oh, this is a good option. And, our habitat surveys have been really great. There's a ton of spawning habitat within that river. And really, since we started the restoration, the Maple River Dam has come out as well. So that's really awesome to see. But we're going to stick to the Sturgeon River as far as a stocking site, just because it's you don't want to start dividing out the number of fish it takes to be successful. Now, with the management plan, you need to start thinking of who's in the lake. You need to know population dynamics, whether everybody's old, everybody's young. We held a population estimate or survey back in 2011 and 2015. 2011 was before I got to the tribe, but 2015 I was there for that. And then we should be doing it again in 2022. I listed a bunch of partners because all these assessments take a lot of people and a lot of time, especially because the numbers of fish in the lake are so low. It's really hard to find them. So I think we netted. There were 3 boats. Each boat had 2 nets. We netted every day for 3 weeks, and we caught less than 100 fish. And I know we had several recaps, which, if you combine the 2015 and 2011 surveys, we think there's only about 658 total fish. Of those, I think it was like 100 or 200 were of spawning age. So there's like a really small cohort that were actually ready to spawn. And just to kind of throw it out there, if you guys haven't seen it already, this is like a length bin. So just take your length and kind of bin them by 90s, 100s, 110s. And we compared, and I put them on here at the same time, but you'll notice that in 2011, you kind of have a hump here. And then when we did the survey again, the hump just shifted over and there really wasn't anybody down below. Well, that's what's happening here is we're not having any recruitment and the fish are just getting older. So that's kind of something we're seeing. There is some size selectivity too with our nets, but for the most part, the population is just getting older. Now in the management plan, we list out things that we want to be doing, and maybe funding is one of those things, but we're currently working on getting a antenna funded, which is a sophisticated extension cord at the bottom of the river that what it does is that electricity creates a magnetic field. And when the fish passes over it, the microchip or the pit tag will send off and will actually record it passively. So it just picks up anybody going by. And so our hope is that we can use this to pick up on fish who have survived stocking and they're swimming out to the lake. And with that, we can maybe get stocking survival. With the lake surveys and the PEs and the population estimates, we're hopeful that because we tag all those fish, that we may get a high enough percentage of the population that maybe we could start thinking about somehow applying a adult population estimate based on how many fish are running the river, which is very similar to what Black Lake is doing. So this is on our to-do list. Probably see this within the next five years or so, as opposed to larval drift sampling. Now, this is something we do on the Black River, right? That MSU has been doing that for a very long time. And they have a nice spawning population there. So when they put the nets out, they find quite a bit. I want to say one year they caught like 70,000 larvae. But for us, there's not enough fish going up the river at this point for us to be able to find any. So this is something in the management plan that we're talking about doing maybe 10 or 15 years from now. But we've got it lined out on a timeline and we're trying to plan for that. Now I'm going to throw out there too, habitat sampling. Side scan sonar and sonar in general has come so far in the past 10 or 20 years that we can actually go upstream, record that data with just like a hummingbird fish finder, record the side scan sonar, import it into GIS, and we can actually map the bottom of the river. We could probably do it to the lake as well. So we have some intentions to do that and just create, like on the Maumee River when they did it, they mapped out all the substrates and so in the water velocities, and they were able to kind of get an idea of, you know, where these fish might want to live at age 0. And so we would probably have something very similar, but that's probably, I would say, within the next 5 years, habitat stuff. And all this kind of trickles into like stocking and recovery goals. You know, how do we know what kind of target we're aiming for? You know, how do you calculate that? And so I figured for you guys, I'd just bring up, you know, how we attack this and how we went about figuring out, you know, our habitat, food availability, spawning dynamics, and then we also can look at other systems like Black Lake or Lake Winnebago. And I'll quick fill these in. Obviously, I already said the habitat. We believe right now that everything is fair play, that they should like it for their adult lives. Food availability, right now the growth is well above average. We think spawning dynamics, you know, Black Lake is seeing a little bit of traction at like 350 spawning individuals. So I'm guessing 400 is probably a good number to aim for. You know, all this we don't really know a ton about. And so because about 25% of the fish spawn in any 1 year, you're actually looking at a number that's spawning population may have to be 1,200 fish or 1,600 fish to be effective and get at least 400 up the river every year. And when we look to other systems, Lake Winnebago targets 1 fish for every 3 acres, approximately. Kind of kicking all that around, we came out with 5,000, roughly 5,000 adults. And you'll see the bottom number, 22,000, is much bigger. That should be all the year classes underneath. So those that are not ready to spawn. And you're probably, if there ever is harvest, I highly doubt we'll be able to keep it all within adult fish only, unless we're spearing in the river. There's really no other way to avoid all the young fish. And so knowing our goals, we kind of get into how many do we stock? What size do we stock? Do we stock them at this really, really tiny size? Or the bottom right, those fish are like They came from the Detroit Zoo, or no, Belle Isle. They came from Belle Isle. I want to say they were like almost a meter long or something like that. But those fish obviously took a fortune to raise to that size. Do you do 1,000 or 1,000,000 little ones, or where's the best cost-effective way? And I did review this presentation, and I got a lot of feedback that I didn't show you guys how we raise sturgeon. And so I figured this kind of goes into the cost as well. When they're little, we feed them sea monkeys, brine shrimp by the billions. And then I put them into a big automatic feeder there. The automatic feeder just has a solenoid and a timer, and it just automatically, and it has an air line going in, so it stirs itself. And what it'll do is it'll fill itself up with a float valve like your toilet. And then every hour it'll flush, or 2 hours, it'll flush in the food, and they'll eat, and then it'll refill itself. And that's how we feed the fish 24/7. Then when they get older, we can just throw them bloodworms, which are frozen midge larvae. And then if we keep any for sturgeon in the classroom, we'll probably start moving to krill because it's a heck of a lot cheaper. But with all this, you have these three sizes. Which size do you choose? And so Black Lake already has done a lot of work on this. And so we just look at theirs. This is called a sigmoid curve. And there's a tipping point right in here, about 150 millimeters, at which we start to see good survival, or at least improving survival. And so when we did our management plan, our goal was to stick on the top side of this bar. So as long as we're above 180 millimeters, we assume that we'll have at least 80% survival. Real quick, I just punched it into a word form to figure out how many fish we do stock. So we have our current population, which was the 650, our target population, which is the total 22,000, our current population, which is 658. And then we have the total stocking years, and then you just have to apply the survival rate. 25 years was chosen intentionally because that's how long we think the maximum life cycle would, from one female spawning to her offspring spawning. And so that's why that number was chosen. They are very long-lived fish, and so we believe that you don't want to just stack up all your genetic diversity into 5 years or 10 years. You're going to want it over a longer period of time to make certain that you get quite a good mix of diversity, genetic diversity. And so the total with that came out to be about 1,100 fish annually. And that's pretty good, right? We can manage 1,100. I think in the management plan, we talked about that we'll be stocking for those 25 years. It's going to take 25 years of monitoring and seeing if those fish survived. Okay, so now we're talking 50 years from the time we started this project. When those fish spawn, it's still going to be 5 years before we can find them in the lake during our netting. So now we're talking 55 years to know if this actually worked. And if you've probably guessed, I'm probably not going to still be here doing this project in 55 years. Hopefully I won't be working in my mid to late 80s. This whole thing, the tribe is really focused, the management plan, and looking at the 7-generation idea. But sturgeon are a very, very good example of that. This is a multi-generational project. This is not going to be just us putting fish in the water and walking away. This is going to take a very, very long time to get the management going or the restoration going. And so in accounting for that, we outline in our management plan too that we need to have some kind of outreach to the community. And the best way that we have so far is the Sturgeon in the Classroom program. And so that was started in, I think, 2013, would have been the fall of 2013, and Pelston signed up for us. And I think the state started one, or Sturgeon for Tomorrow may have started one around a very similar timeline. But the best part about this is that we're bringing fish to the kids, and these classrooms can form an emotional attachment to the fish, a connection. We were lucky enough that the Petoskey Harbor Springs Area Community Foundation sponsored 3 tanks, I think. So we have several tanks in our local area. I mean, we have some classrooms down in Rapid City, Traverse City. Those are just the ones in my program. I mean, Sturgeon for Tomorrow has some across the east side of the state. Sea Grant, I think, has some in Saginaw. Grand Traverse Band started up, I think, 3 more down in Traverse City as well. So the program's growing. We're having a lot of outreach. And at the core of it, a few years ago, there was an issue where we may not have enough fish and the timing would be off. And so LTBB volunteered to hold all the fish for the state to ensure that this program moved forward. And so I just want to point out that, this is a really big deal and that we're really committed to this. There's a curriculum that comes with this that was developed by our education department, and they'll probably smile because I don't know a ton about it as far as like the teaching standards go. But from what I've seen, the teachers' reaction, they seem to really, really enjoy that the standards are all outlined and somebody put all this thought in there. You can probably write in the chat or something how many lesson plans there are. I thought there were more than 18, but I could be wrong. But anyways, I believe GTB is using our lesson plans and our curriculum. And I have a couple pictures here of some of the stuff that they do. Bottom left is where they're doing the Lincoln Peterson mark recapture. Bottom right, they're doing the length and weight of the fish every week. And hopefully in handling the fish, they kind of really get to bond with them. And that's intentional. Really, I have to point out that the main thing that we want this program to do is have these kids come back to the river, put their fish in the river, see the adults, and just see the whole life cycle in front of them. And I think for a lot of these kids, they become very connected to this whole thing. And hopefully our program has inspired them. Because I believe that the future of this restoration is not in stocking or the surveys, it's these guys. It's in the heart of the next generation. And hopefully 55 years from now, whether it's their kids or their grandkids, somebody can be out there to say, hey, we did it. A part of that, if you're not in 8th grade anymore, there's still an opportunity, and we put that in the management plan as well, that we give people the opportunity to reach out and go to like a celebration, as we call it, because it is a stocking event, a release, but sturgeon really need to be celebrated. And so we used to have a potluck. We had like a sturgeon touch tank. We had one in an aquarium so people could just walk by and see without having to get in the water. But you'd be really surprised by how many kids show up to this. And I think that in and of itself is the restoration moving forward. We have a long way to go. We're on 10 cents out of 1,000, but hopefully over time, we'll be able to buy that all back. And I believe that would be it as far as my presentation goes. If you guys want questions?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Kris. That was really informative and wonderful. We do have some questions for you. Let me take a look here. Give me just one second. What's the hardest thing about raising sturgeon in a hatchery?
Well, just like every fish, I think the early stages are normally the hardest. Mm-hmm. But for sturgeon, they really like we do a lot of live feed, frozen feed. Mm-hmm. That can be really expensive. I think we spend, for only 1,000 fish, I know that we spend over $10,000 a year on fish food alone. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that's that early stuff. But there's a lot of diseases too that the sturgeon get that it's not much we can do about, but it's super frustrating.
Okay. We had another question too. Why is the Winnebago population so high, and did it ever or does it still have active restoration work?
So Lake Winnebago, I think, just retained a lot of fish, and they were trapped similar to Black Lake. So Black Lake has a dam on the lower end and the upper end, which makes them easy to get to on the upper end, but they also can't leave on the lower end. And so most of the harvest was probably happening out in the big lake. And so because of that, think of Mullet Lake, those fish could have just gone out through the locks. They could have gone over the spillway. Those fish could easily get out into Lake Michigan, but they can't come back. That happens in a lot of situations, but Lake Winnebago just happened to have a lot of fish. It's a super big lake. It's like 110,000 acres, super shallow. It's great habitat, and they just were luckily able to hold on longer. Like I said earlier, you need like 400 fish to like maybe get this going. They had a heck of a lot more left over, so they were able to bounce back faster. I don't know if they had any restoration. I'm sure maybe they did, maybe in the 80s, but for them it was radiating out, not back in for the most part.
Okay. Just so you know, we've got a couple of people telling you did a great presentation. Also, Amanda Weiner, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, put some information about that education curriculum that you mentioned into the chat if anyone wants to look.
She's a rock star.
Yay. Another question that we have is, can you tell us more about the other fish that you raise in the hatchery?
So we raise Cisco, whitefish, walleye. We're going to be doing kai here in a little bit. Right now we're stocking, hopefully going to stock about 500,000 whitefish into Little Traverse Bay. We used to do about 85,000 Cisco annually. So there would have been 50,000 at this size, there would have been 25,000 at that size. So then the remainder would have been, I don't know, 8 to 10 inches or so. Walleye, we do them pretty small. We have 2 walleye ponds, which were kind of in the early pictures. Ponds are really, fickle would maybe be the right word. They're really hard. It's not intensive, it's extensive. So those are always hard to tell if they're going to produce anything or not. I believe our Cisco and our whitefish are all, and our kai are all research project based. So we're stocking fish in the lake to see if it works and at what size.
Okay. And we have someone asking where the hatchery is located.
So we are located north of the Pellston Airport on Van Creek, just off of Van Road. We're pretty small. I want to say, like, if we run all the wells on full bore, I think we only get to like 170 gallons a minute. As a comparison, I think Odin State Fish Hatchery in the springtime will run upwards of 5,000 gallons a minute.
Okay.
So we are really low flow. And then now we're reusing our water, so it's super, super low.
Okay. We had someone asking, how might sturgeon be affected by the possibility of invasive carp coming into our lakes?
I think that's more of just a, if there is going to be an effect, it's likely going to be a trickle-down effect. So it may not affect the adults as much as their offspring.
Okay.
Food chain issues, most likely, if that does happen.
And we have a question about poaching. It says, with so few adult fish in Burt Lake, I suppose poaching of adults is not a big issue now. However, is there any evidence of any poaching hotspots?
I can't speak to that. I think the COs would probably know better than I do on any of that. In one way, you know, it's great that there is no dam, because it's probably a lot harder to find a fish over the course of 20 or 30 miles, as opposed to them being stacked up in just like a less than 1 mile area. But I'm pretty certain they keep a pretty good eye on the area.
Okay. And with sturgeon as a protected species, how difficult is it to keep from catching them when you're actually fishing in the lakes? Like, how do people avoid them? It sounds like you're out there netting them. But, you know, is there any issue with that, accidentally catching sturgeon and having problems with that?
I don't know if there's any issue. As long as people return them, they do pretty well being handled. That's why we have the kids take them out of the tank and do a length and weight and put them back. You know, right now there's so few fish that I think you should feel lucky to catch one. That being said, I think we've stocked like 6,000 sturgeon so far since 2013. Hopefully they'll become a lot more of a regular occurrence that people get to see them and enjoy them. But that's probably something another 10 to 15 years away.
Okay. What are the major prey species for sturgeon in Burt Lake?
That's a great question. I don't really know that we've done any diet studies.
Okay.
To know what they're preying upon, but I'm assuming it's everything on the benthos on the bottom.
Okay. Why does the tribe only raise native species, and why not salmon?
So we focus on the non-natives, or we focus on the native species and not the non-native, just in that we have so many fish that we've wiped off the map that are no longer here, and nobody's really trying to, I think for a long time, we were the only people stocking Cisco. We were the only people stocking whitefish. We might still be the only, no, Sioux Tribe's doing whitefish now. But for the most part, nobody's trying to help the native species. And there's a lot of the non-native species are causing big problems for the native species, whether it's the salmonids that are screwing things up, the alewife, or they're not being stocked, but they're certainly causing quite a bit of problems, alewife and smelt.
Okay, and it sounds like there was another question with that, concerns with competition with other stocking operations that involve non-native fish like salmon. So is it again the issue of salmon eating the younger sturgeon?
I don't think the salmonids directly have that issue right now. I mean,
Okay.
The biggest problem for sturgeon is just recruitment. There's not enough left to have any year classes coming back.
Okay.
So.
Another question, you mentioned Mullet Lake being too deep to sustain a good sturgeon population. Is there any population that uses the Pigeon River?
I don't know how many fish are there. The last survey I think they had on Mullet Lake had a total population estimate of like 38 fish total, all fish, all year classes. I think they caught most of those fish, there were very, very few fish. That being said, they've been stocking the Pigeon River for some time now, whether they were stocking at the lake or at the river. There's some evidence to suggest that if you've heard of like the stream side stuff where they're raising them on the river, and that will cause them to home back on the river. The Black River, the Pigeon River, and the Sturgeon River all run parallel and have basically the same geology. They're like sister rivers all side by side. So it's likely that they would maybe have some sort of scent memory to those if you were to think that they would have one at all. But really, some studies out of Duluth that looked at some of those stockings from Winnebago into Lake Superior, which is a big no-no now, those fish, only about 30% of them strayed to the wrong river. So if you think on the bright side, even if you didn't raise them there or you didn't put them there, you got a 70% chance they might come back to the correct place.
Okay. How can community members support LTBB's efforts to restore sturgeon populations?
I think a great way for people to support all of this is to certainly get your kids involved, teach them the importance of sturgeon, natural resources in general. But honestly, I think too many people have never seen a sturgeon. Too many people have never touched a sturgeon. There's not a lot of info out there for most people. So I think if anybody in the community wants to do their little part, just participating in stuff like that, joining a sturgeon watch or seeing about getting the sturgeon classroom in a school near you, or even taking your kids or your family or a neighbor to like the sturgeon release. I think that would be a really good thing for the entire restoration. I think that's kind of one of our big interests.
We just have another couple questions. Remind me what size of fingerlings are stocked. How small can they be when you tag them, and where is the tag implanted?
So can we see this screen over here still?
Yeah, we can still see it.
Okay. So they'll look like this, and we do it by weight. So when they reach 10 grams, we pull them out, we tag them, and they get it in between the scoots on their side and the top scoots. And it should be more towards the head. Our goal is to be underneath the third scoot, but sometimes it's as far back as the fifth, just depending on how big they are and if they've grown up or long. So yeah, they'll go in pretty small. I want to say 180 millimeters, whatever that comes out to be in inches. That's typically when we'll stock them out. I want to say we have to wait 2 weeks for the wound, the insertion point to heal up, and that we know the tag will not come back out. But the best part about tagging everybody at the hatchery too, before they go out, is that we don't have to recap them again to have them go over a transmitter, and we'll know that they were there. So it saves us a ton of time down the road.
Okay, great. We have another couple questions. Is there a sturgeon watch for the Sturgeon River like Black Lake?
I do not know, to be honest.
Okay.
Sturgeon for tomorrow might know better than I would.
Okay, sturgeon for tomorrow. I'll make a note, just so everyone knows that I am going to be sending out a recording of this. I can send out any links that Kris wants to share. So I'll make a note to send out a link for that organization. We've got another couple of people saying, great, thanks for all you do. Another question, are the tribes considering restoring native muskies that have been virtually extirpated from many watersheds?
We have not talked about or discussed any muskie work. Muskies are a little more fickle than walleye, and their rearing, it's a little more complicated. So we'd have to do a few changes around here to even be able to try to do something like that. So we're adding a level of complexity as we go. So right now, maybe in 5 to 10 years, maybe, but right now we're not discussing it at the current moment.
Okay. And I believe this is the last question. Are there any sturgeon in Otsego Lake and Gaylord? And is that out of your coverage area?
So we have put some fish into Lake Otsego before. That is a closed system, so there's no river in or out. There may be a creek into it, but there is no, it's closed. There's no way for the fish to leave. And that means that when they put fish in there, they have no intention of them to spawn. So any fish that's kind of, I think they used to put a few fish in there annually, but since then they've put in the fish that are kind of leftovers or something happened. I know a few years ago I thought they crossed two rivers on accident or something like that, so those fish couldn't go back out in the wild, so they had to go up to Otsego. Otsego is a good example of a put and take. We're putting them in. The only anticipation is for us to fish them back out.
Okay, great. Let me check and make sure that was our last question. Another thank you. And that looks like it's it. Kris, that was a really wonderful presentation, and we really appreciate you joining us today. Like I told everyone, this recording is going to be available. I'll send it out to everyone. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, have a good one.